Hi, and welcome to North Vortex. Today it's finally time. It's finally here. The largest project I've made for the channel so far is this new episode of Looking Back about Deathspell Omega's 2019 album, The Furnaces of Palingenesia. I've been meaning to talk about this album ever since it came out in 2019, and one of the main reasons why I want to talk about it is because of the controversy that surrounded it upon its release. Because suddenly people noticed that this Mikko Aspa guy that has supposedly been doing vocals for the band for more than 15 years is apparently pretty shady, and a lot of the lyrics on here sound kinda fascist and evil? So what's going on here? So in this video I want to address this controversy and, more importantly, explain why I think that Furnaces of Palingenesia is an album that goes beyond politics, as well as one of Deathspell Omega's most underrated albums. I still consider myself merely a student when it comes to understanding the band's body of work because of its depth and complexity, but I still want to make a video about this album and do it justice as best as I can. I will leave all sources regarding background information in the description of this video, so you can check them yourself if you wish, and I will also include a credits section at the end of the video to thank everyone who helped me during the creation of this video. That being said, let's get right into it, and before we talk about the album proper, there are some prerequisites that I want to establish, starting with the band's collaboration with Mikko Aspa. First off, there's little official evidence that Mikko Aspa actually does vocals for the band, but considering all the information publicly available, it is pretty much confirmed. Anyway, for those of you who watched my Prerequisites review, what follows will be a little bit of a recap. Following the release of Furnaces in 2019, Deathspell Omega gave their first interview in 15 years with Bardo methodology. This was actually the first in a trilogy of interviews, the last of which was conducted by Roy Christensen of the Imitatio fanzine in 2020 and published on Cult Never Dies. The second interview, which was also with Bardo methodology, I do not have access to since it's only published in print. Like never before, Deathspell Omega offered insight into their creative process, the inner workings of the band, and also supplied a great deal of context for the content of the album. Usually Deathspell Omega are as secretive as possible in an effort to detach the art from the artist, so let me just stress it again, Deathspell Omega giving an interview is a big deal. What's important about these interviews is that they shine some light on the structure of the band and contextualize Mikko Aspa's contributions to their creative process. But who is this Mikko Aspa guy anyway? Mikko Aspa is a prominent figure of the Finnish NSBM scene with his projects Clandestine Blaze and Vapauden Risti, owner of several record labels such as Northern Heritage Records, which operates out of his record store, which sells, among others, NSBM records, NSBM fanzines, and neo-Nazi literature. This only scratches the very surface of his activities, and if you're interested in finding out more, there are sources in the description of this video for further reading. However, this should give you an impression why people aren't exactly happy about Aspa being involved in one of the most influential and respected black metal bands past the year 2000. So what's the context given by the Bardo methodology interview I just mentioned? In the interview, Deathspell Omega revealed that the band can be thought of as a collective more so than an actual band, with the French core members writing all the lyrics and music. Surrounding that is a kind of second circle. Contributors that are recruited for their talents but don't always work with the band and instead are invited by the core members to participate when seen as appropriate. According to the band, some of the people in this second circle are involved in earthly politics and are on the opposite end of the political spectrum. This makes it likely that Mikko Aspa is no more than a session vocalist for the band who is invited to participate because of his sound or his talent as a vocalist, or maybe a deeper spiritual connection with the band. Because as the band also explains, there is no shortage of people talented enough to play their music out there. It's more about a certain spiritual connection beyond that that makes them choose who to work with. If this is still too ambiguous for you, or you cannot look past that Mikko Aspa is involved in this project at all, that's understandable. Covering the whole of detaching art from artists would go beyond the scope of this video, but I want to say that ultimately it's up to you to decide. Educate yourself and make your own decision about how you want to engage with the art or how far you want to get involved. Now, with all of this out of the way, let's talk about the concept behind the Furnaces of Palingenesia. On this album, Deathspell Omega leave behind their themes of theology and metaphysical Satanism and trade them in for the socio-political, detailing the rise of a totalitarian order. Deathspell Omega like to plan well in advance, and they explain that there were hints to Furnaces on synarchy, for example the excerpt from Milton's Paradise Lost at the end of the album. Additionally, others have noted that the lyrics at the end of the title track for Synergy seem to foreshadow what was to come. And along with its release, Furnaces was described as Janus in the ninth circle of hell, a prophetic abomination recorded on Gia ante anno 1984, vomiting 2084 in the shadow of the horns. In the ninth circle of hell, as in the Inferno in the Divine Comedy, Satan is being kept enclosed in ice, and frozen alongside him are sinners guilty of treachery. Janus is a Roman god and represents beginnings, transitions, passage, and endings, among other things. In their interview with Roy Christensen, Deathspell Omega described their work as being as Janus, facing both past and future. The reference to Orwell's 1984 here goes without saying, and both the word prophetic as well as the mention of the year 2084 imply that this album is about something that is yet to come or may well already be in progress. While In the Shadow of the Horns may just be paying tribute to the early days of black metal, it could also mean that all of this is the work of Satan, which we will get back to later. One noticeable change on this album compared to the band's previous work is that the lyrics here require a lot less context on the listener's end to understand. Because so far the band's work has always made extensive references to literature and often seemed impenetrable without some literary overlap. While the band still references many sources on Furnaces, this time around they seem much more complementary, meaning that knowledge of the source or its significance is not required to understand the story or the meaning of the album. And one very important piece of information to keep in mind when reading the lyrics to Furnaces is that Deathspell Omega described themselves as Batailleon. The band has often and heavily referenced the works of French author and philosopher Georges Bataille in the past, and Bataille was both anti-left and anti-right-wing, so Deathspell Omega view him, and subsequently themselves, as immune to mundane politics, as they put it. I don't usually review albums on a strict track-by-track basis, but I think in this case it's helpful for following along the narrative and addressing both music and lyrics as we go. First off, it's important to note that a lot of the lyrics on here are actually omitted from the performance, and the most complete publicly available version of the lyrics can be found on the album's Bandcamp page. Neither Meaning nor Justice kicks off the album with a relatively straightforward proposition, but let's dive a bit deeper here and ask ourselves what is actually being said and what type of world this album is being released into. In the West, more so than the rest of the world, we have removed the scaffold of religion that supplies meaning and justice to our lives. Against the backdrop of religious belief, we can always assure ourselves that there is some form of higher justice or grand design. The unjust will be punished, if not in life, in the afterlife, and the just and virtuous will be rewarded. And I'm not taking a stand for religion here, but originally one of the prime functions of religion was to structure the way humans live and live together. To offer an unshakable foundation which incentivizes us to live a good life in order to find salvation and eternal happiness in the afterlife. Without this greater than ourselves means to justice and meaning, we have to face the reality that life is inherently meaningless and there is no means of guaranteeing or enforcing justice. Thus, this order that speaks to us on this album identifies our world as inherently flawed and promises to lead us into a better world. A world in which by our will alone we shall make our lives just and meaningful. This references the modern thought that we can tap into the infinite potential of every human, and if we can only figure out a way to make them right, whatever that means, we can create the world we wish for. Musically, this prologue is already unusual for Deathspell Omega, because it's not only slower paced, it's atmospheric and cinematic with these large, ominous horns that the band makes much more use of on this album compared to previous releases. From here we enter the album proper and start off a career highlight for the band with the Fires of Frustration. There is an important signal right at the start of the lyrics here as the author addresses the men of resentment. This is a philosophical concept that has been thought about by Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, among others. Resentment comes about when one is unable to accept their failure or sense of inferiority and projects it onto an external cause. Through this, circumstance or other people are at fault and the ego is assured of its integrity. These are the people that the author is interested in, and it offers to them freedom from freedom. This is the most prominent line on the track, so let's take a closer look at it. Freedom means one is free to design their life as they choose. The flip side is that one is responsible for their actions, responsible for their successes and failures alike. We have to shoulder the responsibility and consequences of our actions while constantly being faced with decisions in a complex and imperfect world. Those who are able to overcome their weaknesses and face their shortcomings will emerge as successful, while those who are unable will find themselves defeated. This creates inequality, and to the men of resentment, the successful are at fault. While this feeling of inferiority, unbelonging, and inequality can lead to positive outcomes, here it leads to irrational hatred and a desire to destroy those who sit unjustifiably above you, as the band so strikingly puts it. Now, these people who view themselves as incapable of fault, as victims, are invited by the Order to join their ranks and find equality. They will be relieved of the responsibility of governing their own lives, they can stop thinking for themselves, and they can trust the Order to make the right decisions for them. All they have to do is obey. And obey they will, because the men of resentment find nothing but oppression in the old world they seek to destroy, and the Order is here to equip them with the means to do so. On this song we also have the first hints that the lyrics on this album are not to be taken at face value. Every revolution carries within itself the seed of its own destruction, and the lyrics on this track establish that the desires of the oppressed are only good for tearing down, not for building up. Further, there are signal phrases here like "we will feed you the illusion that," or "turn you into expendable hounds," that treat us to an in and outside view of what the Order is scheming. Now, in the real world there are actually two things at play here: inequality of entrenched social structure and inequality of merit. While socioeconomic status is largely heritable, merit isn't. While society struggles with the problem of the former, it does not mean that those at the bottom of society deserve to be there. They are not lesser people, and they too compete in this world that gives every one of us a different starting line. So even if we come from different backgrounds, all of us can do things that are valuable. In the eyes of the men of resentment, someone who is somehow stronger or better than them cannot be valuable because that would make them less. As you can see, appeasing this inferiority complex will not penetrate to the root of the problem. On the musical side here, first we have this instrumental pattern that drives the crooked guitar layers upwards with outstanding work on the accentuation. There is lots of detailed and intricate vocal layering that offers much to discover. And halfway through, the song abruptly breaks into some of the most melodic and ravenous material the band has ever written. Relentless and dramatic guitars mirror the sweeping societal changes as the masses are incited by propaganda. And it's in this combination with these dense, biting and surgically precise lyrics that makes this one of the best songs the band has ever written, and one hell of a second track. Next up we have Arma with its literal call to arms for the members of the Order. And ignorant of the history of the world and its complex nature, they set forth. In their black and white view of the world, they are the oppressed, the victims that fight the good fight. So no matter the means, they are justified because they are fighting against oppression. This mirrors modern day sentiments in which those who perceive themselves to be oppressed become untouchable saints. Further, the Order causes a bloodshed in the name of love, because all we want is equality, and anyone who opposes that or expresses doubt must be an enemy of equality, right? The lyrics here also underline how far the indoctrination of the Order penetrates, as dying in service to the Order makes one a valuable stone that paves the way to the ultimate goal. Note how the band makes use of references to regimes like Nazi Germany and applies them to modern day sentiments, not to liken them, but to underline the dangers of simplifying how we view the world. Moving on to the music, this is another unusual track for Deathspell Omega. Once again on the slower side, Arma features a prominent focus on rhythms and angular guitars, and also brings back these cinematic horns at the climax of the song. This is also the first ever Deathspell Omega song to feature a music video. This one was made by Dane Sora, who's worked with Ulcerate, Imperial Triumphant, Amun-Ra, Shamash, Rain, and many more. The video is largely abstract and shows humans that are indistinguishable from one another in monochrome landscapes of brutalist architecture. Moving on, Splinters from My Mother's Spine begins a trend in the delivery of the concept of the album, which becomes more apparent from here on. At this point, a lot of the concepts the album deals with have fundamentally been established, and from here on there's a lot of reinforcement. While the lyrics start to feel a bit repetitive from this point onward, the band still weaves new nuances into the concept of the album. On this song, the Order turns to the private life and declares that the concept of family is to be undermined to the point of abolishment. This sort of dissolution of the family is a school of thought that is also not exclusive to any political movement or camp. For example, the Communist Manifesto identifies the family as one of the prime sources of inequality. In that sense, it's only logical to get the matter of family out of the picture. This song also showcases a songwriting approach or pattern that Deathspell Omega make prominent use of on Furnaces, where they alternate between chords or quickly move up and down the neck, which kinda sounds like a falling down a flight of stairs. This creates a feeling of imbalance and is especially well placed just before the halfway point of the song, where it creates a sense of collapse that mirrors the downfall of the institution of family. The lyrics of the next song, Imitatio Dei, mostly appear to reinforce how deeply the conditioning of the order penetrates. By now, the members of the order have completely given up themselves in service to the order. Despite the writings on the walls, in their desperation to belong, they shut out everything else and cling to the illusions fed to them by the order. The most noteworthy line here alludes to the increasing defactualization of discourse we see, where feelings have become more important than facts. What makes this line so incisive is not just the observation here, but also the cynicism in the statement that matters of the order are matters of the heart. Cold logic cannot reach the men of resentment that were given purpose by the order, even though their path is a dead end for all to see. Musically, the song once again makes use of these patterns that I mentioned for Splinters, and here they create a sense of rising tension in the second half of the song. Next up we have the most peculiar song on the album, 1523, even though it's really more of an interlude. The few lines for this track reference Thomas Müntzer and the period of his life he spent in the German town of Altstädt. Müntzer, a contemporary of Luther, was a preacher and theologian during the Reformation that resulted in the split of the Western Church into Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. Unlike Luther, however, Müntzer was far more progressive and radical in his thoughts and caused controversies wherever he went. During his time as the appointed preacher of Altstädt, Müntzer preached his reformed version of the doctrines in German. Because at the time religious services were customarily held in Latin and thus unintelligible to the general population. Müntzer's services were so popular that he even drew crowds from the neighboring towns and villages, much to the dismay of the ruling counts. Müntzer proved to be unyielding to threats and interventions, and in 1524 he had to leave the town of Altstädt as tensions with the local rulers grew. Now, what is the significance of these events in the context of the album, and why do we even dedicate an entire interlude to this? I can't say with complete certainty, but to put it simply, Protestantism was a type of populist movement, and in the case of Müntzer, quickly gained traction. This new movement that gave more interpretive power to the individual was now threatening to overthrow the established order. And here I want to ask you to take a moment and consider this removed from the people involved and the worldly matters, so to say. Remember that religion is intended to be a scaffold that provides meaning and justice to our lives. So I assume the band sees a similarity between this crucial time in the Reformation and the concepts they tackle on this album, at least enough to give it its own chapter. And moving on, the next song here, Sacrificial Theopathy, is by-the-book propaganda, including creating an enemy, spreading misinformation, inciting xenophobia, and dehumanizing the other side. Further, the order invokes a sense of tribalism among its followers, as a common enemy is an effective tool for unification. What's particularly striking here is the contrast in the second half of the lyrics. Over the course of the album it becomes more apparent that despite everything they've done, nothing but misery awaits the members of the order in the future. Despite that, they can only further delude themselves as the burden of guilt and the knowledge of the reality of our world has become too much to bear. The order utilizes the human desire for internal consistency to drive its followers into staying obedient. For once a person starts down a path, they can always justify their behavior, and it would take the strength of character to admit their mistake, endure losing face, and correct their course. There's also a seemingly minor line here which speaks to what I think is a central part of the album's message, which I will get back to later. Musically, Sacrificial Theopathy makes outstanding use of the interplay between the drums and the guitars. There are these distinct kick drum beats that accentuate the intro, which transitions into these violent, roaring tremolo melodies and back again. And after that, into these short bursts of massive tremolos around the midsection. Later the track somewhat mellows out around these discordant guitar chords and starts setting up for the next track, Standing on the Work of Slaves. Standing on the Work of Slaves doesn't necessarily add any new points to the album, but there are a few noteworthy lines here. First we have these actually quite specific references to Greek mythology with Achilles in the Battle of Troy. The members of the order are now likened to mythological heroes, destined and even expected to attain immortal glory. The rest of the lyrics here lay bare the process of institutionalizing the order's indoctrination and also bring up the point of bureaucracy. While mindless, unthinking bureaucrats will give the author free rein, the lyrics here also mention Saint Fawn as a non-actionable icon. What exactly Saint Fawn refers to is hard to pin down, so if you have any ideas, please share them in the comment section. Further on, the lyrics actually reference the album cover for Furnaces, which was created by the late Timo Kotola. Towering monoliths over an industrial landscape of a world on its deathbed. As if being processed, people are being led through these incomprehensible giant machines. Finally, this song features some of the most striking and also some of my favorite lines on the album, as they capture the perfidious evil of the order and this carrot on a stick belief it feeds to its followers that eventually, surely, they will achieve their utopia. Musically, Standing on the Work of Slaves is a build-up that opens with a thick bass synced up with muted guitar chords. The guitars become more discordant and grow into these downward spirals of dramatic tremolos as the vocals keep hammering into us that line of "when the final resistance hangs on the gallows." Next up, Renegade Ashes once again retreads a lot of ground lyrically, but there are a few things worth noting here. There's some notable rhetoric here in the sense that while members of the Order are supposed to appear strong on the outside, on the inside they're actually insecure and driven by fear and desperation. In the beginning, the Order lured in its followers with promises of unity. Finally, they would be able to feel that they belong and that there's a place that needs and values them. But this was a farce, and whatever might have been there has been eroded. The vocal performance for these lines is fantastic, as it sounds like a mad dictator scouring the ranks for dissenters. The guitars that accompany this section again alternate between motifs and race up and down the fretboard to create the sense of drama and disorder. Overall, Renegade Ashes is another high point of the album, especially in terms of songwriting. Starting with hammering, mid-paced blast beats and great use of cymbal accents, bleak chords accentuate the atmosphere. Skittish guitars make the transition to a sort of chugging section before these rabid tremolos set in. Once again, these huge, thundering horns descend ominously and give the end of the song a cinematic touch. And now, we've reached the climax of the narrative with Absolutist Regeneration. This song has a ton of lines, many more than any other song on Furnaces, and basically it's a grand review of the album so far. This song details the Order's process of indoctrination and how it leaves diversity and virtue as shallow husks. They are merely upheld in the Order's vision as something functional, not something with actual meaning. As the rules for fitting in become stricter, members of the Order are increasingly dependent on others telling them what to say or think. And though they've been conditioned to think the right way, they still cannot escape a feeling of insufficiency and guilt. Because any thought a person may inevitably have that collides with the teachings of the Order is not their own. It must have somehow found its way into their mind through their weakness. The Order has reached its goal of making their will the universal law of nature. And in true 1984 fashion, reality is now what the Order dictates. To cite a line from the lyrics here that summarizes the album perfectly, "From the legion of those adrift to the legion of one. From lively chaos to sterile order. From life to death. What a triumph." Absolutist Regeneration features some of the most memorable guitar work on the entire album, with its twin guitars that belt out shocking, disorienting tremolo waltz. The entire song has this atmosphere of spiraling out of control, falling down, confusion and terror that shake you to the bones. Especially in the last quarter of the song, with these brief and dissonant symphonic additions that sound the alarm from the high heavens before the hour of redemption arrives. Now remains only the epilogue of the album with "You Cannot Even Find the Ruins." The lyrics for this track are brief and a stark contrast to the rhetorically charged manifesto of previous songs. On this track, the lines are pensive and dejected, and under total control, the world has been reduced to complete stillness. There is no trace left, no ruins of the world of the past. There is only the stale and sterile now in which nothing can exist or become. The album closes with the exhausted resignation that whatever is now is right, and a lament for the erasure of the past. Musically, this song is unusual for Deathspell Omega with its slow, trotting rhythm and sparse guitar work that slightly unravels as the song progresses and some subtle synth layers come in. Now that we've covered all the individual tracks, what does it all mean? How does it all come together and fit into the framework of the band's discography? After working through all of this, rereading the band's interviews, looking at their body of work so far, this is my personal interpretation of the meaning behind this album. The Order is Satan. This theory is based on a few statements the band has made about their work and this album, as well as the fact that the Order is conspicuously shapeless. First of all, the Order is such a vague entity because exploiting inevitabilities of our world, human nature, their means of manipulation, none of this belongs to any particular group or movement. It's not merely political. Deeper reading makes it clear that these are things that have and will be made use of by many groups and movements throughout the history of humanity, sometimes even inadvertently. Secondly, there's two main statements the band has made about their work that support this theory. An egregore is an occult concept representing a distinct non-physical entity that arises from a collective group of people. To put all of this together, the Furnaces of Palingenesia is a representation of the band's view on reality. The Order is indistinct because it's a thoughts-given shape of movements and events all over the world. It fits into the trajectory of the band's body of work so far, of man's relationship with the divine, our abandonment and subsequent spiritual drought, extending into and affecting the real world. After all, the Synarchy of Molten Bones already foreshadowed the band's shift from the metaphysical to the physical. Ultimately, what is the band trying to say here beyond communicating this worldview? While it could be taken at face value as something fatalistic and misanthropic, I would like to advocate for some positive takeaways here. This album urges us to face our complex reality, cultivate strength of will, and to find common ground instead of fleeing into simplicity and apathy. In this sense, the Furnaces of Palingenesia is a warning, a nightmare vision of a future only we have the power to prevent. I want to take some time here to credit and thank all the people and resources that helped me in the creation of this video, be it directly or indirectly. First of all, I want to thank my friend Nyshes, who assisted and guided me in the creation of this video. Without his vast knowledge, analysis and discussion of this depth wouldn't have been possible. While he doesn't usually dabble in extreme metal, in fact he has yet to hear a single note of this album, I will leave links in the description to places where you can find his writings if you're interested. Next I want to thank YouTube user LixXZeal for his guitar covers of songs of this album no one else has covered so far, as well as letting me use parts of them in this video. They really helped me gain a better understanding of the instrumentation on this album, as well as illustrating some of my points to you. You can find a link to their channel and their covers in the description down below. I would also like to thank the members of the Absences podcast and in a broader sense the people over at the Deathspell Omega subreddit for their exchanges and thoughts about the band and their music that helped me shape my own ideas. Alright, that's it from me. This video was a lot of work and was originally intended to be out for the album's 2nd anniversary in May of this year. However, as I kept working on the script for this video and tried to do this album justice as best as I could, the scope just kept expanding. And even with all of this is obviously my personal interpretation of the album and it's beyond me to cover everything on here. In fact, many questions remain. For example, why does the band choose to omit so many lines here from the performance and then repeats so many others? I also want to say that while working on this video, I've gained a much deeper appreciation for this album and the band. Reading their interviews for this album again, I was really impressed by how in tune they are with their work and how much sense everything here makes when you put the two together. And while many people thought Furnaces was one of the band's weaker albums, I think the opposite is true, and Furnaces proves that Deathspell Omega is still one step ahead of the rest of the game. Anyway, if there's something on this album that you have thoughts about that didn't get covered in this video, please leave them in the comments down below. And as always, leave your thoughts about the album in general in the comments down below as well. I really hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you did, please like, share and subscribe and hit that bell so you never miss a new video. Over here right next to me you can find more content from the channel. Thank you very much for watching, have a good one, and I'll see you next time. And this time it won't take 4 months.